It was a scene no one at Brookdale High could have imagined. The sky above the school thundered as a sleek black helicopter circled before descending onto the football field. Teachers, students, and staff rushed out in shock, shielding their faces from the roaring wind. And then, as the blade slowed, the door opened, and out stepped one of the most powerful billionaires in the state. But here's the part that left everyone frozen in disbelief. The very first words out of his mouth weren't to the principal or to the board of governors. He looked past them all, straight at the trembling elderly janitor standing by the gates, clutching his worn cap in both hands, his deep brown skin creased with years of struggle and dignity. "Sir, I owe you more than you can ever imagine." Gasps filled the air. How could this be? Just yesterday, this very man had been kicked out of the school, humiliated, mocked, and discarded like trash. And now, less than 24 hours later, the richest man most of them had ever seen was addressing him like royalty. Before we dive into how this unbelievable twist unfolded, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We share stories like this every week, stories that remind us that sometimes the people society pushes aside are the very ones who hold the keys to destiny. Mr. Samuel Lewis was a 68-year-old janitor who had worked at Brookdale High for nearly 2 decades. His curly gray hair was always tucked under his faded cap, his uniform a little too worn, his shoes a little too scuffed. But he carried himself with quiet pride. To the students, Samuel was more than just a janitor. He was the man who stayed late after basketball games so no one walked home in the dark. He was the one who slipped granola bars into the lockers of hungry kids who couldn't afford lunch. And he was the one who always had an encouraging word, no matter how rough his own day had been. But to Principal Richard Hawthorne, Samuel was just a nuisance, a relic, a waste of school funds. Hawthorne was a man in his early 50s. Pale, tall, always dressed in the sharpest suits. To him, prestige was everything, and Samuel didn't fit the picture of the polished, elite institution he wanted Brookdale High to be. One fateful morning, Samuel walked in early as usual, carrying his mop and bucket, but instead of being greeted by the usual quiet halls, he found Principal Hawthorne waiting for him with 2 security guards. "Samuel Lewis," Hawthorne sneered, "your services are no longer required. Effective immediately." The old janitor blinked, confused. "But sir, I've been here almost 20 years. "You're a liability. You make the school look unprofessional," Hawthorne interrupted coldly. "Pack up your things. You're done here." In front of the security guards, Samuel was forced to empty his tiny locker into a cardboard box. His hands trembled, but he didn't argue. He didn't cry. He simply tipped his cap and whispered, "This school will regret this one day." The guards laughed. Hawthorne smirked. To them, it was nothing but an old man's empty words. That evening, Samuel sat on the porch of his small rented home, staring at the sunset. He had no savings, no pension worth speaking of. All he had was his dignity, and now even that felt stolen. What no one knew, however, was that Samuel's life had once intersected with greatness. Many years ago, long before he became a janitor, Samuel had done something extraordinary, something that would one day return to the surface in the most shocking way. But for now, all the world saw was an elderly black man tossed aside by a school that thought he was beneath them. The following morning at Brookdale High was business as usual. Students chattered in the hallways. Teachers gathered in the lounge. Principal Hawthorne strutted through the corridors, proud of his decision to modernize the school by getting rid of Samuel. But then, a sound none of them expected shattered the calm. The deep, rhythmic whump-whump-whump of helicopter blades filled the sky. Windows rattled, books fell from desks. Students screamed and ran to the windows. A sleek, black helicopter descended slowly onto the football field. Its polished body gleamed under the morning sun. Teachers rushed out in alarm. Principal Hawthorne straightened his tie nervously. As the dust swirled and the blades slowed, the door swung open, and out stepped a man in his late 50s, wearing an immaculate tailored suit. His presence was magnetic, his posture commanding. Whispers erupted. That's Charles Davenport, the billionaire, the one on Forbes? What is he doing here?" Hawthorne's chest puffed up. He assumed the billionaire must have come to see him, perhaps a new donation or an award. But then, Charles Davenport didn't walk toward the principal. He didn't even glance at the board of governors who had rushed to the scene. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd of students and staff and locked on to Samuel, who stood by the gates, cap in hand, stunned and uncertain why he was even there. And then Charles said the words that froze everyone in their tracks. "Mr. Lewis, I've been searching for you." The crowd gasped. Hawthorne's smug smile collapsed. Teachers and students alike whispered in disbelief. How could a billionaire know the janitor? Why would he call him Mr. Lewis with such respect? And most of all, what debt could possibly connect the richest man in the city to the poorest man in the school? As Charles took a step closer, his voice heavy with emotion, he said, "Because of you, I am alive today." Everyone froze. The football field went silent. And that, my friends, is where we'll pause for now. What do you think Samuel once did for this billionaire? And how will it turn the tables on the arrogant principal who mocked him? Share your thoughts in the comments.
The crowd on the football field was frozen in silence. Students gawked. Teachers exchanged anxious glances. Principal Hawthorne's smug grin had completely evaporated. The billionaire, Charles Davenport, stood tall in his immaculate suit, but his voice cracked with something rarely heard from a man of his power: humility. "Mr. Lewis," he said again, his eyes fixed on the stunned janitor, "you may not remember me, but I will never forget you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. What was he talking about? Decades earlier, when Charles Davenport was just a rickless teenager, his life was spiraling out of control. He grew up in a wealthy but broken home, and one night, after a fight with his father, he stormed out and ran into the path of danger. On a dimly lit street, a car came speeding toward him. Charles, lost in anger, hadn't even noticed, but a stranger had. That stranger was none other than Samuel Lewis, then a young factory worker walking home from his late-night shift. Without hesitation, Samuel had thrown himself forward, shoving the boy out of the car's deadly path. Charles tumbled to the ground, bruised but alive. Samuel wasn't as lucky. He took the brunt of the impact, suffering injuries that left him struggling to work for years afterward. Charles's wealthy family whisked him away that night, never looking back. But Charles never forgot the face of the man who saved him. And when he finally tracked Samuel down, decades later, it broke him to learn the truth. While Charles built an empire, Samuel had been reduced to scrubbing floors in a school that didn't even value him. Now, standing before the entire school, Charles's voice rang out like thunder. "Principal Hawthorne, yesterday you dismissed this man like he was nothing. But I stand here to tell you that this man is the reason I'm alive. Without him, there would be no Davenport Enterprises. Without him, none of my billions would exist." The students gasped. Teachers shifted uncomfortably. Hawthorne's face turned pale. Charles turned to Samuel, who stood clutching his cap, his eyes glistening with tears he couldn't hold back. "Mr. Lewis," Charles said firmly, "from this day forward, you will never want for anything again. I owe my life to you, and today I make it right." Hawthorne tried to interrupt, stammering, "Mr. Davenport, with all due respect, this school—" But Charles silenced him with a glare so sharp it could cut glass. "This school? This school humiliated a man of integrity, kindness, and sacrifice. And you dare speak of respect? You should be ashamed." Students erupted in murmurs, some even clapping quietly. For the first time, the mighty Principal Hawthorne looked small, stripped of his power. And then Charles dropped a bombshell. Effective immediately, I am making the largest donation this school has ever seen, on one condition. Samuel Lewis is reinstated not as a janitor, but as the honorary head of student affairs. The entire field erupted in shock. Samuel stumbled back, his voice shaking. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Charles placed a hand on his shoulder. "Say nothing. You've already said enough through the life you've lived. Now let the world honor you as you deserve." The same students who once walked past Samuel without notice now cheered for him. Teachers who had ignored his quiet sacrifices now looked ashamed. And Hawthorne, the man who mocked him, stood red-faced, powerless. But just as the moment seemed perfect, the story took a darker, more dramatic turn. Because Samuel's reinstatement would not go unchallenged. In the shadows, Principal Hawthorne's lips tightened into a sinister smile. He wasn't done. He wasn't about to let an old janitor and a billionaire make him look weak, not without a fight. As Charles's helicopter prepared to leave, Hawthorne watched from the sidelines, his mind racing. And later that night he picked up his phone, dialing a number no one at the school would have ever imagined. When the line clicked open, he whispered, "Don't worry, I'll handle this. If Davenport thinks he can humiliate me, he has another thing coming. Tomorrow, we make sure Samuel Lewis is finished for good." The cheers from the football field still echoed in Samuel's ears long after Charles Davenport's helicopter lifted into the sky. For the first time in years, Samuel Lewis felt seen, valued, respected. But as the crowd dispersed, one man's heart burned with rage. Principal Hawthorne. His authority had been shredded in front of students, staff, and even the media. And in his mind, there was only one way to fix it: destroy Samuel Lewis once and for all. The next morning, teachers found anonymous notes slipped into their mailboxes. "Do you really want a janitor deciding student affairs? How safe is it to let someone like Samuel Lewis around your children?" Rumors spread like wildfire. Parents called the school demanding answers. Some even whispered that Charles Davenport's donation was just a publicity stunt. But Samuel, unaware of the poison being spread, walked the halls with renewed pride, greeting students who now waved at him with smiles. That evening, in the dim light of his office, Hawthorne met with a group of board members. His voice was low, seething with bitterness. "Gentlemen, we cannot let an old janitor and some billionaire dictate the future of this school. Samuel Lewis may have Davenport's favor, but he does not have ours. We need to show the world who he really is." One board member frowned. "But what can we do? Davenport's influence is too great." Hawthorne smirked. "Then we attack from where it hurts most. Samuel's past. Dig into his records. Find anything that makes him unworthy. If we can't find it, we'll create it." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but nodded. Hawthorne had spoken. Meanwhile, Samuel returned home to his modest apartment. For the first time in years he sat at his small wooden table, sipping tea with a smile. On the counter sat a gift, an engraved watch from Charles Davenport himself. On the back it read, "To Samuel Lewis, the man who saved my life. May the world finally see the hero I always knew you were." Samuel's eyes welled with tears. He whispered to himself, Maybe it's not too late to matter." But he had no idea that shadows were closing in. 2 days later, chaos struck. The local newspaper ran a headline in bold, ugly letters. "School's new head of student affairs accused of theft in past job." The article claimed Samuel had once stolen money from a factory he worked at decades ago. There were no clear records, no evidence, but the insinuation was enough. Parents protested. Students whispered in confusion. When Samuel walked into the school, he was met not with smiles, but with cold stares. The joy that had lit his heart only days earlier dimmed under the weight of suspicion. He stood in front of his locker, his hands trembling. "But this isn't true," he muttered. And then he saw Hawthorne, smirking in the distance. At an emergency meeting, Hawthorne slammed the newspaper onto the table before the school board. "You see, this is the man Davenport wants us to honor. A thief, a fraud. We cannot allow this disgrace to continue." The board murmured in agreement, though a few members looked uncertain. One teacher spoke up. "But shouldn't we investigate before making such claims?" Hawthorne's voice was sharp. "Do you want to risk the safety of this school on a janitor's word? No, he's finished." And with that, the board voted, suspending Samuel Lewis indefinitely. Samuel returned home, crushed. The watch still gleamed on his counter, but now it felt like a cruel reminder of hope slipping away. Sitting on his bed, he whispered to himself, "Why do they always look for a reason to tear us down? Why is kindness never enough?" But as despair weighed heavy on his heart, a knock sounded at his door. When Samuel opened it, his eyes widened in shock. Standing there, with fury burning in his eyes, was Charles Davenport himself. "Samuel," Charles said, his voice trembling, "I saw the headlines. I know Hawthorne's behind this, and I promise you this ends now." But what Charles had in mind would shake not just the school, but the entire community. Because this wasn't just about Samuel anymore. It was about exposing the corruption of power itself. Will Charles Davenport uncover the truth before Samuel's reputation is destroyed forever? Or has Hawthorne already set in motion a trap too deep to escape?
Charles Davenport didn't waste time. By the next morning, his private legal team and investigators were already at the school, digging through decades of records. And what they uncovered shocked everyone. It turned out the so-called theft Samuel was accused of at his factory job 30 years ago was a lie. The truth? Samuel had exposed corruption at the factory, reporting supervisors who were embezzling money. But instead of rewarding him, they framed him, forcing him to quietly leave to protect his family. And who had spread those lies all over again? None other than Principal Hawthorne, who secretly contacted an old accomplice from that factory. Davenport's voice thundered in the school board meeting. Samuel Lewis is not a thief. He is a whistleblower, a man who sacrificed his own career to protect others. And you, Principal Hawthorne, have weaponized lies to destroy him. Gasps filled the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing. Hawthorne's face turned pale. His reign of intimidation was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Samuel stood silently in the corner, trembling. For years he had carried the shame of that false accusation, never telling anyone the full truth. Now, with Davenport's words, the weight finally lifted. Tears streamed down his face as students in the crowd began to chant his name. Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. The very halls where he once pushed a broom now echoed with honor for his name. But Davenport wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. This school deserves leadership built on integrity, not arrogance. And as of today, Principal Hawthorne, your services are no longer required. The board, faced with overwhelming evidence and public outcry, voted unanimously to remove Hawthorne from his position. Hawthorne tried to protest, but security escorted him out as cameras captured his humiliation. The powerful man who thought he could crush a janitor had been exposed for the fraud he truly was. In the aftermath, Charles Davenport made an announcement that shook the community. This school will no longer see Samuel Lewis as just a janitor. Starting today, he will serve as director of student mentorship.
Because who better to guide our children than the man who has shown humility, sacrifice, and true courage? The gymnasium erupted in cheers. Samuel, overwhelmed, shook his head in disbelief. Me? But I'm just— No, Davenport interrupted, smiling. You are not just anything. You are exactly what this school needs. And so the tables turned. The man who had been underestimated, mocked, and cast aside was now celebrated as a pillar of strength. Samuel's story reminds us, never let anyone define your worth by their prejudice or lies. Sometimes the world will try to bury you, but the truth has a way of rising, louder than the noise of hate. But just when it seemed Samuel's life was finally at peace, a shadow appeared on the horizon. 1 week later, another helicopter descended onto the school's lawn, but this time, it wasn't Davenport's. Out stepped a stern-looking woman in a black suit carrying a briefcase. Reporters swarmed as she introduced herself. My name is Evelyn Moore, federal investigator, and I'm here because Samuel Lewis's name has come up in something much bigger than you realize. Gasps filled the crowd. Samuel froze. Davenport narrowed his eyes. What could this mean? Was Samuel's story only just beginning? And that's where we'll pause Samuel's story for now. We've seen how a man the world dismissed as just a janitor ended up shaking an entire school to its core, proving that true worth can't be measured by titles or uniforms. But the question is, should this be the end, or is there more to uncover? Do you think Samuel's journey is only beginning? Should we continue this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could shape the next chapter. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the most unexpected voices carry the loudest truth.